The people of Brazil have passionately embraced the challenges we all face to protect our natural world.
The palace confirmed something few expected. Prince William, the Crown Prince long seen as the monarchy's steady anchor, has been fighting a private battle that finally overwhelmed him. Behind his calm smile and unwavering sense of duty, he had been quietly falling apart while his family watched, unable to intervene. The announcement appeared without warning early one cold December morning, a brief and clinical Kensington Palace statement that stunned Britain and beyond. Newsrooms erupted, broadcasters interrupted programming, and ordinary people across the country paused in disbelief, struggling to process that the one royal who always seemed composed and dependable had reached a breaking point. International reactions followed swiftly, especially in the United States, where memories of William as a grieving child resurfaced, making the news feel deeply personal. What made the moment truly extraordinary was not only its emotional impact but the palace's rare honesty. An institution known for projecting strength openly acknowledged vulnerability. The statement plainly confirmed that after months of intense personal and institutional pressure, the Prince of Wales would reduce his duties to focus on his health and family, offering no spin or euphemisms, just the quiet truth that even the future king could no longer carry the weight alone. A longtime aide, stepping briefly into the cold December air for privacy, was overheard quietly admitting, "We asked too much of him. We all knew it, and we asked anyway," a sentiment that echoed through the royal household as the weight of the announcement settled in. At Windsor, King Charles, having spent a sleepless night grappling with the decision to approve the statement, was burdened by a deep sense of paternal guilt, understanding better than anyone the lifelong tension between personal limits and public duty. Seeing his son, the heir he had raised to shoulder that same responsibility, finally acknowledge he could not carry it alone struck him profoundly. Princess Anne, who had long warned that the system was unsustainable and that even the most capable individual would eventually buckle under such pressure, felt no satisfaction in being proven right, only sorrow. Queen Camilla, reflecting quietly on William's journey from grieving teenager to overwhelmed future king, recognized the rare courage it took to admit vulnerability within an institution that rarely allowed it. By mid-morning, the global response had intensified, with social media flooded by concern, speculation, and an unexpected wave of empathy, as mental health advocates praised the palace's transparency while others worried about what William's struggle signaled for the monarchy itself. The truth, though never stated so plainly, was that this moment had been building for far longer than the public realized, shaped by months of unseen strain that began intensifying in early 2024 when Catherine's health crisis forced William into the dual role of full-time working royal and primary caregiver. As he balanced official duties with supporting his wife and reassuring their children, his workload only grew heavier, especially after King Charles's cancer diagnosis in February required William to assume additional constitutional responsibilities. Though he maintained a calm exterior, those close to him noticed subtle changes: shortened humor, fraying patience, skipped meals, and relentless days without pause, signs of an exhaustion born not of physical fatigue, but of carrying too much for too long, a reality Princess Anne recognized immediately when she studied him during a private meeting in March and saw the unmistakable toll of accumulated pressure finally reaching its limit. Princess Anne recognized the signs immediately: emotional depletion, the hollow look of someone running on duty alone with nothing left in reserve, and she raised the concern carefully with King Charles, who was already carrying the strain of his own health struggles and the anguish of watching both his wife and daughter-in-law confront serious illness. Charles listened with growing unease, yet felt trapped by circumstance, knowing the institution needed William to remain functional and that there was no alternative heir ready to absorb the burden if he stepped back. By late spring, as Catherine began cancer treatment, the pressure intensified further, forcing William into the impossible position of projecting public optimism while privately fearing the worst. Staff often saw him late at night, still at his desk after evenings spent with his family, determined not to fail either role. Summer brought little relief. Catherine's appearance at Trooping the Colour in June, celebrated as hopeful by the public, demanded exhaustive behind-the-scenes coordination that William managed personally, protecting her and shielding the children from scrutiny at a cost no camera captured. All the while, he was absorbing the emotional weight of everyone around him, supporting Catherine through her darkest moments, listening to Charles's fears, reassuring his children, and providing stability for staff navigating unprecedented uncertainty. Trained since childhood to be the steady one who never breaks, William accepted every burden without protest. By autumn, however, the strain became harder to conceal. A September engagement revealed a distracted prince with shorter answers and a smile that failed to reach his eyes, a change publicly dismissed as fatigue. Inside Kensington Palace, the truth was clearer, and one October night, when a senior advisor found William still working near midnight amid piles of constitutional papers, charity briefings, and medical updates, his quiet refusal of help left the advisor deeply unsettled, recognizing the unmistakable signs of someone pushed far beyond his limits. Catherine, still recovering and physically fragile, began to notice the changes as well. Her husband, once fully present at home, now seemed distant. Even when he was there, his thoughts constantly racing as he tried to hold together the many fractured pieces of their lives. The breaking point did not arrive in a single dramatic moment but formed gradually in early November, the result of months spent being strong for Catherine, supporting his father through constitutional responsibilities, protecting 3 children through uncertainty, and representing a monarchy under relentless global scrutiny, all while privately carrying the fear of losing his wife. By mid-November, those closest to him finally began using a word they had long avoided: unsustainable. Princess Anne said it first during a family meeting. Queen Camilla echoed it days later, and even King Charles, still recovering himself, acknowledged that William had been carrying too much for too long with too little support. The final straw came in late November during what should have been a routine briefing, when William listened to plans seen through the assumption of his endless availability and strength. When the meeting ended, he walked to the window and, for the first time in anyone's memory, quietly admitted that he did not know how much longer he could continue at that pace. That moment set in motion the events leading to December 21st, because once William voiced his struggle, those who loved him realized they could no longer stand by and watch him break. The true turning point followed not through confrontation but through a series of quiet observations that accumulated until they became impossible to ignore, culminating in an early December meeting at Windsor Castle where Princess Anne, drawing on decades of experience, formally laid out her concerns to King Charles in a private drawing room, arriving with a rare folder of notes, staff observations, and a 6-month timeline of William's schedule that painted a picture no one in the room could dismiss. "William is functioning," Princess Anne said firmly as she placed the folder between herself and King Charles. "But he isn't well, and we've been pretending not to see the difference, setting aside protocol in favor of truth." Charles, his own exhaustion etched into his face, listened in silence as Anne methodically laid out the reality William had been living since January. Catherine's surgery and cancer diagnosis, the emotional needs of the children, the constitutional duties William absorbed during Charles's illness, the relentless public schedule, the careful management of media narratives, and the private fear he never voiced. "He's 30 pieces of himself," Anne said quietly, "and none of them are whole," an observation born of her own decades under royal pressure. As Anne described specific moments, the late November evening William withdrew from a family dinner only to stand alone in a dark corridor, the night spent working past midnight, the mechanical tone that had replaced his warmth in meetings. The weight of guilt settled heavily on Charles, who understood both as a father and as a king how the institution had demanded the impossible. Queen Camilla later joined the discussion, noting how William now resembled Charles during his own most difficult years. Present yet absent, functional but emptied, a comparison that deeply unsettled him. What troubled the family most was not a dramatic collapse but the slow erosion of someone they loved, reduced to going through motions he could no longer sustain. Inside Kensington Palace, staff shared similar concerns, with William's private secretary bluntly concluding that he needed intervention, not support, a sentiment quietly passed to senior officials and ultimately to Catherine, who had already noticed the tension in his body, the distant look in his eyes, and the rigid control he maintained at home. One early December evening, after the children were asleep, Catherine confronted him gently but directly, telling him he was drowning and refusing help. His practiced reassurances fell flat, and her clear-eyed response that he had been saying the same thing since January while only growing worse became the catalyst for what followed. The next day, Catherine reached out to Anne, and by mid-December a small group and Camilla, Catherine, and eventually Charles were united by a shared realization that William was in crisis, even if he could not admit it himself, and that something had to change for his survival, not the institution's convenience. William had been conditioned his entire life never to admit weakness, never to step back, and never to place personal well-being above institutional need, which made the family's discussions both delicate and urgent. Held in quiet corners of Windsor and Kensington Palace, away from staff who could not know how precarious the situation had become, they debated their options: a private family intervention, a restructuring of duties framed as routine adjustment, or a public acknowledgement that would remove William's ability to refuse help by making it official. Princess Anne argued forcefully for transparency, insisting that if the matter were handled privately, William would simply convince himself and everyone else that he could manage, whereas real change required making it impossible for him to continue as he had. Queen Camilla worried about the public fallout, knowing the monarchy was already navigating Charles's health crisis and Catherine's recovery, and that adding William's struggle risked projecting institutional fragility, yet she also recognized that pretending everything was fine while he quietly collapsed served no one. King Charles struggled most deeply, torn between his role as monarch, which demanded decisive action, and his role as a father, burdened by guilt for allowing his son to reach this point. After many sleepless nights weighing consequences and seeking counsel, he reached the same unavoidable conclusion as the others. William needed help, and the only way to ensure he accepted it was to make stepping back impossible to refuse. By December 20th, the decision was finalized. The announcement would be released the next morning, brief, honest, and unequivocal, confirming that William would reduce his schedule and prioritize his well-being with full public support from the palace. What none of them fully anticipated, however, was how William himself would react when confronted with a plan that evening in his private study at Kensington Palace, where, as winter darkness pressed against the windows and Charles and Catherine gathered with quiet resolve, William sensed the gravity of the moment and stood by the fireplace, tense and defensive, bracing himself for words he already feared were coming. Charles finally spoke, his voice steady but weighted with emotion, telling William they needed to talk about what had been happening to him over the past months. A question that hung in the air with devastating simplicity. William's expression barely shifted, though his shoulders tightened as he gave the same hollow response he had relied on for months. He was managing, but in that room, before those who knew him best, it sounded less like confidence and more like desperation. Princess Anne cut through the pretense with characteristic bluntness, telling him he was not managing but barely surviving, and that they had all watched him fade while pretending otherwise, insisting that it had to stop. William bristled, falling back on responsibility and duty, only for Catherine to interrupt quietly but firmly, reminding him that the family needed him whole, that the children needed their father present, and that she needed her husband, not someone destroying himself trying to hold everything together alone. The mention of the children caused a brief crack in his composure, and when he insisted he was doing it for them, Camilla gently but pointedly observed that he was doing it for everyone except himself, which was precisely the problem. Charles stepped closer, shedding the distance of king and heir to speak simply as a father, telling William that a statement would be released the next morning and that he would be stepping back from certain duties, not as a request but as a decision already made. William reacted with disbelief and anger, protesting that no one could make that choice for him, until Anne sharply reframed it as survival rather than abandonment, producing the folder documenting the late nights, missed meals, and moments of visible disorientation that proved how unsustainable his life had become. As William hesitated to even touch the evidence, clinging once more to institutional necessity, Charles answered quietly that the monarchy needed a future king who would live long enough to wear the crown, not one who burned out before reaching it. Silence followed, broken only by the winter wind outside, as the weight William had been carrying finally pressed down without escape. Catherine moved closer, reminding him softly of how strong he had been for her and the children, but telling him with quiet certainty that he could not continue without breaking, and something in her voice finally reached him. Seeing his exhaustion reflected in her eyes, William admitted almost inaudibly that he did not know how to stop, fearing that everything would fall apart if he did, and, her own expression softened, reassured him that it would not fall apart but adjust, reminding him that the institution had survived before he carried this burden alone and would survive while he recovered the strength to carry it again. And paused, then added with rare gentleness that William had to let them help him and allow himself to be human, a sentiment echoed when Charles placed a hand on his son's shoulder and admitted, with visible emotion, that while he had made many mistakes as a father, he would not make the mistake of standing by while his son destroyed himself for duty. He told William the statement would be released the next morning and that he would step back with the family's full support, whatever came next. Surrounded by those who knew him best and had watched him strain to meet impossible expectations, the fight slowly drained out of William, replaced not by peace but by the exhausted relief of someone finally given permission to stop. When he asked what he should tell people who questioned why the future king could not handle his responsibilities, Catherine answered simply that he should tell the truth, that he was human, that he had carried an unbearable weight through an impossible year, and that stepping back was not weakness but wisdom. The conversation continued for another hour as they discussed logistics, wording, and the public response, but the most important decision had already been made, and William had agreed with quiet resignation, understanding he had no other choice. As the others prepared to leave, Charles lingered to tell his son he was proud of him, not for being strong, but for admitting he could not be strong alone, a different kind of courage altogether. William did not reply, but something in his expression shifted as the door closed and he was left alone in the study where he had spent so many nights trying to hold everything together. By morning, the world would learn what those closest to him had known for months, that the future king was struggling and, for the first time in his life, allowing himself to be helped. As frost formed on the windows outside, William finally sat down by the fireplace and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had been carrying. The hours before dawn on December 21st passed in eerie stillness at Kensington Palace, with little sleep for William as he moved restlessly through the private apartments, repeatedly staring into the darkness until, by early morning, he sat alone in the study waiting for the moment that would change everything. Just as Princess Anne arrived earlier than expected and found him exactly where she thought he would be, isolated amid the familiar symbols of duty, and asked if he was having second thoughts, her tone neutral but kind, and William slowly shook his head, admitting instead that he was wondering what came after. An honesty he rarely allowed himself after months of living only from obligation to obligation without imagining a future beyond survival. And sat opposite him in the winter-darkened room and told him that what came next was learning to live differently, not smaller, but more honestly, adding with her usual bluntness that the institution would adjust as it always did, and that the real question was whether he would allow himself to adjust with it. By 6:30, the final version of the statement was ready, crafted overnight by the communications team to balance dignity with unprecedented transparency, a stark 17-word acknowledgement that would break decades of royal reserve. Charles arrived shortly before its release, drawn but resolute after a sleepless night, having reached the quiet conclusion that protecting his son mattered more than preserving appearances. He offered William a final chance to reconsider, knowing it was symbolic, but William appreciated the gesture and quietly agreed to let it go out, saying he would rather face this on their own terms than wait for collapse to decide for them. At precisely 6:47, the statement appeared across official palace channels confirming that following sustained personal and institutional pressure, the Prince of Wales would reduce his schedule to prioritize his health and family, and its impact was immediate. Within minutes, broadcasters interrupted programming, news banners spread across screens, and people across Britain stopped mid-movement in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the news with the image of the steady future king they had always relied on. The reaction rippled outward just as quickly across the Atlantic, as American networks pivoted mid-broadcast, the quiet hours before dawn suddenly charged with the realization that something fundamental had shifted, and that the truth the palace had finally acknowledged could no longer be unseen. The breaking news reached American audiences mid-broadcast, with anchors abruptly halting their segments as producers fed updates from London, describing the palace's confirmation of William's struggles as genuinely stunning and unprecedented in modern royal history. Analysts struggled to find parallels, emphasizing that the heir to the throne had publicly acknowledged an inability to sustain his pace, a revelation that carried added weight for viewers who remembered Diana's sons as grieving children and had long seen William as a symbol of resilience. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior staff monitored the reaction with growing intensity. Reporters sought clarification, foreign embassies requested briefings, and charities linked to William's patronages inquired about commitments. Queen Camilla arrived mid-morning, reviewing coverage with practiced detachment but quietly noting that public concern reflected genuine care for him. Princess Anne immediately managed logistical adjustments, redistributing engagements with precision, postponing, reassigning, or shortening duties, including state visits, while maintaining essential constitutional responsibilities. Camilla, meanwhile, tended to Charles, who, though resolute in authorizing the announcement, was visibly burdened by guilt as a father and the weight of his kingly duties. At Kensington Palace, Catherine took charge of the household environment, filtering calls and shielding the children, while maintaining their routines as a stabilizing anchor. William himself moved through the day in a strange numbness, caught between relief at finally being allowed to step back and anxiety over public perception, guilt for delegating duties, and fear of appearing weak. By evening, a clarifying palace statement underscored that William's reduction in duties was open-ended, tied to his recovery, signaling a rare prioritization of personal well-being over institutional optics. Reactions were mixed but largely empathetic. British media expressed cautious support, American coverage highlighted human interest and mental health implications, and polls showed overwhelming public backing, reframing the story as one of courage and necessary self-preservation rather than failure. As staff worked late into the night updating schedules and coordinating institutional adjustments, William sat with his family, finally able to be present rather than constantly preparing for the next crisis. Amid the private calm of Kensington Palace, he experienced the faint but vital sense of possibility humanity reclaimed after a year spent drowning under the impossible weight of duty.